Hello and welcome to a Matter of Fraud podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Ferguson, Associate Lawyer at Investigation Counsel. This podcast is brought to you by Investigation Counsel, fraud recovery lawyers. A brief disclaimer for our audience. Although we talk about fraud law and fraud adjacent topics on this podcast is not legal advice. If you have been or think you have been the victim of fraud, please contact a fraud recovery lawyer as soon as possible to preserve your rights. Okay, in this episode, I will be talking to Norman Groot, principal here at Investigation Counsel, a very accomplished fraud recovery lawyer, and really a pioneer in the field of fraud recovery law. The topic for our discussion today will be, of course, a little bit of background about the firm, Investigation Counsel here, and what we do, Norm's personal story, as well as our discussion about a recent episode, the CTV W5 program entitled Crypto Bros. So I personally thought that the episode was very informative and really well produced. But as individuals who are not kind of intimately involved in the case, there might be some follow-up questions that I thought our discussion would be helpful to answer and kind of go through. So I hope this episode is interesting and helpful to people. And as they say, let's get into it.
Let's get into it.
So thanks, Norm. Thanks for taking the time. Would you mind just introducing yourself and telling our listeners who you are?
Yes, I started my policing career when I was 18, right out of high school. That lasted till about, for about 7 years. And during that time, I did some work for about a year and a half in what they called special services, which was the drug squad, the fraud squad, auto theft, that sort of thing. And in that time period, although most of it was in the drug squad, I did gain some interest in fraud type of cases. Even when I was a uniformed beat cop, I used to go into money marts on my downtime when there was nothing to do and pick up their check fraud cases and roll these guys for check frauds to see if I can get into bigger frauds and all that sort of stuff. It was a bit of fun. And then after an economics degree and a law degree, I articled at a place called Fraser Beatty, which is now Denton's, so one of the big national firms. And then I wrote a book on the law for private investigations. Ended up at a law firm that represented the insurers who insured the private investigation industry. So I started representing private investigators and cops in civil cases, and then started doing insurance fraud cases, which eventually led to creating this law firm, Investigation Counsel, mostly because I needed more flexibility and assisting victims of frauds. Flexibility in the sense of retainers. Couldn't be tied to a monthly payment plan sort of retainer program. Most victims can't facilitate that. So after now, we've been in business since 2007, so 15 years, and we've handled a wide array of fraud cases, many of which you've been involved in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been somewhat entertaining.
I would definitely say entertaining. So that's interesting. I mean, I'm just even learning some things about you I didn't previously know, but it seemed like your interest in fraud was there from the beginning of your policing career and kind of followed the dots along through your early law career. And eventually it was kind of revealed to you, or you discovered that you had this real passion and then wanted to pursue and open a firm dedicated to this specific area of law.
Yeah, not exactly, but somewhat. So, I mean, like any young police officer, I wanted to be involved in the action. So I liked fighting all crime, violent crime as well, of course. But the real turning point was when I was researching this book on the law for private investigations that I learned that for people in policing, most of them that left policing and went to work for the banks or insurance companies came from the fraud bureau. In other words, that's where you could take a step out of policing into the private sector. The other route into the private sector was into more like low-level security. So the investigation and security industry was essentially broken into 3 tiers. That's how I always saw the world. The lower tier, which is your random security people. Then the second tier, which is policing. Maybe some police don't like to hear that. And then the third tier was the banks and these high-end accounting firms. And essentially at the high-end accounting firms, they were doing more of the large-scale fraud cases involving investment frauds, that sort of thing. So there was very few cases reported on fraud investigations that accounting firms were involved in as far as what the private investigators did for them. And so that's why I ended up talking to these people when I researched my book. And that's where I could see an avenue to go with this area of law that I was pioneering, I guess.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess that kind of brings us to the firm here, Investigation Counsel. So how would you describe the firm and what we do? Like, could you give us a little bit of a detail about what day-to-day life is like here at the firm and the kind of cases that we deal with?
Sure. I always think of this firm operating like a hospital. We have an emergency ward, which is true. We have an emergency ward where we deal with people who are hemorrhaging financially and they need to be triaged, stop the bleeding. And that's the intake process. And in the intake process, we determine whether we're going to be bringing injunctive motions to freeze assets, to trace assets, to advise people on how to deal with the fraudsters that they've been victimized by. And then after a case moves out of the emergency ward, after it's been triaged, after a statement of claim has been issued and it goes into discovery, the discovery phase of litigation, that is like the ward, the recovery ward, where people are in. And then finally they get discharged, we get a judgment, and hopefully we try to recover.
They leave the hospital.
They leave the financial trauma hospital. And that's really how this place operates. So, for example, you do a lot of injunctive work, and that is what we're dealing with almost every day. Every day we're in the emergency ward, dealing with some sort of injunctive motion. And then there's also a kind of a parallel to private policing. We are out occasionally doing these private search warrants. We are taking statements from people, getting affidavits, bringing motions, getting what the police would call production orders, which are just obtaining orders to get bank records from the banks. Other investigative stuff. It's highly investigative what we're doing.
Right.
And actually acting like the Crown prosecutors as well. We are the private prosecutors of these civil fraud cases.
Right, that's right. That's a good way to look at it. We are directing kind of the pursuit of a recovery for our clients, like a monetary judgment and recovery. Can you give us a little bit of, or we can have a discussion about the types of cases that we deal with here? So, I would say that the fraud schemes that we see run the gamut in terms of the details or, how the fraud was executed. Some that come to mind are, primarily investment schemes. So, we can have a discussion about those, but generally like the Ponzi scheme. So.
Right. So most of our cases are investment fraud cases. Most of the rogues pulling investment frauds that we deal with are people who are not licensed through the Securities Commission. And there's a whole wide array, of course, of the schemes that are perpetrated. currently, like what we're going to talk about, is schemes involving cryptocurrency and how they are now part of the whole Ponzi scheme realm. But there's a wide array of investment frauds. There's also like immigration frauds we deal with. Romance frauds are almost all investment frauds, just under the cloak of some sort of false romance. There's internal frauds that we deal with, mostly bookkeepers and internal controllers ripping off their employers. There's shareholder frauds that we're dealing with, some shareholders ripping off other shareholders within a corporate setting. Construction type case frauds, where contractors are ripping off their clients. Even psychic frauds. We did a very strange psychic fraud case worth a lot of money.
That's right.
That's quite an entertaining story to tell.
That's right. And actually, that's a good segue into my next question, which is kind of, in your time at the head of this firm, have you noticed that fraud is, like most things, like cyclical in nature, that it kind of rises and falls with trends, economic trends, for example?
So yes and no. I mean, Warren Buffett would say that when the tide goes out, when the economy declines, you see who has their shorts on. And so there is an aspect of cyclical natures to frauds, but generally speaking, fraudsters don't really pay attention to economic cycles. Ponzi schemes end for any number of reasons, not always because the economy generally has gone down. And so, in my experience, the stream of cases that get reported to us is pretty constant. The type of cases that get reported to us does change. So when there was a run on Bitcoin, where it was ascending in value, where there was a frenzy in Bitcoin, a lot of people were getting ripped off. When the value of Bitcoin dropped, the number of cryptocurrency type of frauds that were reporting actually decreased. And most of it was because when cryptocurrency was ascending in value, people were investing like crazy. They were getting these statements from these fraudsters that said their accounts reflected whatever. And then they found out when they tried to withdraw the money that they were really never invested in anything at all. And so when the market went down on cryptocurrency, people stopped investing. Right. And then stopped finding their cases or their accounts were fakes.
Right.
But then other type of cases came in place. So in the probably 2022, 2023, there was a lot of email compromise, bank account type of frauds. This was a thing that was going on for a while, and a lot of people were reporting having their money ripped out of their own bank accounts, and to what extent were the banks liable?
Right, phishing schemes.
Yes.
Yeah. Right, that's interesting. I wonder if we could talk about, we're going to talk more detail about cryptocurrency fraud schemes, but your point about us actually receiving more inquiries while the market is at its peak, could we look at fraud as like a leading indicator of a market cycle? That's pretty interesting. But it's true, I think, my experience and your experience, that right now we're in a current trend of cryptocurrency schemes. Maybe it's not at its peak right now, but it's kind of a trend that's been bubbling along.
Bitcoin has now almost reached its highest value that it was.
Right.
So I anticipate that the number of crypto type frauds, investment frauds that'll be reported to us will start to increase again.
Right, right. And that's playing on people's fear of missing out.
Greed.
Greed, wanting to get invested in this kind of strange category of investment.
An investment they don't understand.
Right.
And where they give complete control to a complete stranger.
Right, right. And oftentimes, especially with cryptocurrency, I think it's important to point out that it is a technologically and even conceptually complex investment. So it kind of lends itself well to fraud because most people have to rely on somebody else to provide them access to this market or explain to them how this investment might work. Like they're reliant on somebody else, which, in a lot of cases could be a bad actor or somebody who's not actually looking out for their best interest. That's a good segue into your involvement in the current and really fascinating case that resulted in the W5 episode called Crypto Bros. We will provide a link to both the episode and to the blog post that you recently made that's available on the Investigation Council website. But for those who are unfamiliar with the W5 segment, the W5 segment informed Canadians generally about a foreign exchange and cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme that was perpetrated by somebody who self-proclaimed the Crypto King, as well as two similar schemes, I'll call them, perpetrated by two associates of the quote-unquote Crypto King, Aiden Pleterski, those individuals being Colin Murphy and Ryan Rumble. And so the blog post that you made that I said we'll link to in the episode show notes is really detailed and goes through the specific dates, what happened in the various ongoing court proceedings, the bankruptcy, your civil proceedings that you're handling here. But I wanted to have this discussion to kind of answer some questions just that I've been hearing based on, my family and friends that watched the episode. Because although the episode is really good and informative, there's sometimes some lingering questions. So can you provide kind of a high-level overview of the scheme and the various participants in it that I've just mentioned?
Sure. Aiden Pleterski, as far as, as reported in that show, was dabbling in cryptocurrency trading. And probably, even though I don't know this for sure, had made some money. Because while the crypto market was ascending, almost anybody could have made money.
Right.
And so he would have been explaining to people in his circles that he had made money, and people would have said to him, well, here's some of my money. Can you make me some money? And initially this probably happened. But what Aiden Pleterski learned was that he could solicit funds and report virtually anything out to people, and they would believe him. And as long as they got something back and they thought that they were getting these astronomical type of returns, the money kept coming in. Most of Aiden Pleterski's victims are all word of mouth, people who know each other. He didn't set up a website that did it. At a certain point in time, he went to Forbes magazine and purchased an article written by himself where he proclaimed himself the Crypto King, which just added to his hysteria and the amount of money that started flowing in his direction. What's been reported by the trustee is that very little of this money was ever actually traded. And what trading there was only took place at the beginning of when the scheme was happening. And that's what buttresses the belief that Pleterski had figured out just how simple it was to convince people to give him money. So then the question becomes, at what point and what caused his Ponzi scheme to fail? And that kind of links into these other two guys, Murphy and Rumble, both of whom had provided money to Pleterski. Murphy got a significant return on some money initially. So did Rumble. Rumble decided that he was going to open up his own investment company, thinking he could solicit money from people in his own community and make money more or less as a middleman, but he didn't tell any of these people that their money was going to Pleterski. He said to them that his company had traders working within it that could make these significant returns. And then with Murphy, he didn't create a company. He just got his own money back and told a few of his friends, and that escalated to him receiving a whole bunch more money, which who knows what really happened to it all.
Right. So a big part of the driving factor for kind of all of these three individual but connected schemes was the promise of really high returns to
Right.
investors.
And the media frenzy going on about cryptocurrency generally.
Right. And this was happening in the time frame of approximately 2021 and 2022.
Yeah, yes, 2023.
Right. So after watching the W5 episode, some people are left asking, really, who would trust the crypto bros with their money? So do you have any insight into that question?
Yeah, again, most of the people knew each other one way or another, 1 degree of separation, 2 degrees of separation. They believed that people they knew were making astronomical returns. They wanted to be part of it. Their greed got the better of their good judgment, and they blindly transferred vast sums of money, often money they couldn't afford to lose, to Pleterski or the guys that were funneling money to him.
Right. So in that regard, it wasn't just a single factor, it was a multitude of factors. The human nature kind of for wanting to get in on an investment when it's perceived to be, really good and going up and to the right. The fact that various people believed they were making these high returns, and some investors did receive, monthly or kind of periodic payments of what were alleged to be kind of return on investment payments, right?
Yes, I would say the trust factor wasn't in Pleterski himself. The trust factor was in the people who told them about the money. So initially, Pleterski develops the trust factor by providing various people returns, and then those people go and tell others. And the second wave of investors are actually trusting the first wave of investors. The first wave of investors are trusting Pleterski because they actually did get a return.
Right.
And then it just multiplies after that.
Right. Yeah, that's a good distinction to make, that there's kind of two levels or two lanes, I guess, of trust we can think about here. I mean, if you come to me and say, trust me, this is happening, I would trust you implicitly. But if your trust is based on trusting somebody else, I don't necessarily have to be fully trustworthy of that person because I actually trust you.
Right.
So it's kind of like leveraging those two lanes of trust.
The whole due diligence guard was dropped,
right,
simply because of the trust that I know you generally, and I
Right.
trust you generally.
Right. And you've told me you're making these high returns. You've told me you believe this is real because you've got the money in hand. And then the kind of snowball rolls on and escalates from there. So I've also heard from some people who did not really understand what happened or what was shown in the W5 segment with Colin Murphy's cell phone. So as documented in the W5 segment, there was a phone that was hidden and then it was found and then somehow it ended up back in Murphy's possession. So can you just kind of explain that aspect to us?
Sure. We went after Colin Murphy because the client that we were dealing with had been shown by Colin Murphy a crypto wallet with a balance of approximately $4 million US. We wanted that phone. We wanted to seize that crypto. And so the court gave us an order to search wherever Murphy was. He ended up being at his girlfriend's place at the time that we executed the search order. And it's a bit of a long story, but it's kind of been depicted in the W5. There was a barrier to entry, which we had to get through to get into the residence. Once we were in the residence and the search started, at a certain point in time, the people who were conducting the search went out to Murphy's truck in the driveway. We had a court order to search the truck as well. When Murphy came in, Murphy went out while the search of the truck was being done. When Murphy came back in, he went directly into this bathroom on the main floor. He was in there for an extended period of time. When he came out, one of the investigators suspected that he was in there too long. It didn't seem right, so we searched the bathroom, found a phone. This was the phone that we were hoping to recover the crypto through. And when the investigator placed the phone on the counter to have the independent solicitor log the phone and obtain the password to get access to the phone and then access to the crypto account, Murphy swiped the phone back. And at that point, Murphy said, if you want this phone, you're going to have to physically take it from me. Murphy's a pretty strong guy. We don't have the right to use force on one of these civil search orders. So that's where another standoff took place. And the bottom line was Murphy didn't turn it over. He showed up in court the next day, turned over a phone that had been completely wiped of all its data. The crypto wallets, if they were on there, certainly weren't on there anymore. And as a result, the judge sentenced him to 5 months in jail.
Right. So we can't use physical force in the execution of Anton Pillar orders. So when he swiped the phone, in reality, there was no way to get it back from him other than to pursue him in a later contempt of court proceeding, which did eventually happen. And that's what he got sentenced for. So, simply in the moment in the kitchen when the phone was stolen, there was literally nothing that anybody else could have done really to get the phone back.
Right. And this has never happened before.
Right.
We've done many of these search orders. We've never had the person who's the subject of the order actually try to take evidence back and want to engage in physical violence.
Right.
One interesting part about his case is that we also got a court order to seize weapons from Murphy, and we ended up seizing a bunch of weapons and actually selling them off. Highly unusual case.
Right. Right, because I think, one thing that people should understand about these private search warrants and Anton Pillar orders is there's an incentive to cooperate because it's purely about preservation. So at that moment in time, we're not seeking to gather information and then have it be disclosed to the other side immediately. We're just seeking to preserve everything, to basically put a box around it and make sure it's preserved through our data forensic expert that we use. And so usually people will comply because they know this is purely just about preservation at that point. But Murphy was not even willing to comply.
Right. So the order is to preserve evidence, which in that case is data, which is mostly what we're after these days, and assets. So if he had 100 gold bars, we want to seize his 100 gold bars. On his phone, we want his data. Murphy's excuse for not turning over the phone was that there was X-rated pictures of his girlfriend. We're not interested in that.
Right.
And number one, we're not interested in. Number two, we don't get to see it.
Right.
It gets turned over to an independent lawyer, to an independent data forensics person, and then a dispute over what is relevant and what is not relevant can happen at a later court date. We don't get to look at Mr. Murphy's phone until it's been vetted for relevant data.
Right. Right. So another common question that I have heard is, pretty simply, why aren't these individuals in jail? And I guess one of them currently is, but maybe you can just kind of explain that to us. And, people are kind of left enraged, I guess, by the fact that these people should be, suffering some more intense consequences.
Right. So in the Pleterski case, what made this case more interesting than most was that Pleterski was subjected to an asset freeze order in the civil courts in, say, June of 2023, July of 2023. So there was some form of judicial control of Pleterski at the time. The mistake made, for reasons unknown, was that they never went after Pleterski's data at the time when the initial case was brought. At a later point, the initial investors who were going after Pleterski didn't want to share the information they were receiving with other investors. And there's a lot of them. There's at least 150, perhaps a lot more. So a group of other investors who weren't getting the information assigned Pleterski into bankruptcy. The problem with that is that it stayed the civil action, took away the court orders that were pending on Pleterski, and essentially left him under no judicial control. And then the trustee who was in charge of the bankruptcy didn't take steps to put those controls back in place. So Pleterski, quite obviously, has not reported his assets to the trustee. And then he started flying around the world and making YouTube videos. And he was in Europe and in LA and in Australia. And people are wondering why this bankrupt is spending money as if there's no tomorrow. So with respect to the other two guys, Murphy and Rumble, we were retained by people, and we put those the proper judicial controls in place. In other words, we got asset freezing orders. We got orders for their passports to be surrendered. In the case of Rumble, he didn't surrender his passport. He fled the country, and the court issued an arrest warrant. So we, through the civil courts, have an arrest warrant issued. And the reason the criminal system does not work to put controls on these guys is because there is some decision called Jordan, which stands for the proposition that from the time of arrest to the time for trial, it has to take place within a fixed amount of time. The result has been that the police don't go out and arrest people once they have reasonable probable grounds to do so. They have to wait till their entire investigation is complete. This takes months, if not years. And so there is no quick arrest. There is no quick control put on these fraudsters through the criminal system. It may happen at one day, but by that time, the money's all dissipated. So really the only practical way for victims of fraud to move is through the civil court system, and that's why we operate this emergency room in this law firm.
Right. Civil courts to the rescue, I would say. Yeah, so that's interesting, I guess. Good for listeners and people who generally viewed the program and asked, where is the criminal system in all of this? We don't know what stage, if any, a criminal investigation is at because, as you mentioned, there's this Jordan ruling. And so if a criminal investigation is ongoing right now, which we don't know, they would be doing that in secret. And, my understanding is that, from what you just mentioned, they would want to make sure that their investigation is more or less complete, kind of ready to get put on the trial track before making the arrest. Is that kind of the idea?
It's almost all correct. There is an ongoing criminal investigation.
Right.
We have spoken to the criminal investigators only because we assist the victims in reporting their criminal complaints. But the criminal investigative system operates in a cone of silence.
Right.
So we don't know what status, where they're at, whether charges will actually be laid, that sort of thing.
Right. And I think some viewers were particularly angry with the fact that Aiden Pleterski seems to be living this continued lavish lifestyle, which is the subject of, the reporting from the outset of this case. He portrayed this crazy lifestyle with luxury vehicles and private jets and mansions and traveling all over the world. And some people would view, what was put out in the W5 segment as just his lifestyle continuing kind of unabated by the fact that there's all this ongoing litigation against him. But I think what you mentioned is that there's really no cap on his spending right now. He can spend
Right. And
whatever he
if he was going
wants.
to be controlled, it would be done by the bankruptcy trustee. The
Right.
bankruptcy trustee is the only person who can bring applications to a judge to attempt to restrict his lifestyle. That hasn't happened effectively. There was 2 initial attempts made, but the process to actually put restrictions on people often takes more than 2 attempts, and they stopped making the attempts. In my view, they should have continued, but again, I'm not privy to what went on in the bankruptcy trustee meetings with their inspectors.
Right. And so the trustee, I think I understand, I think I have the figures correct. It's about 40 million that they've traced. Is that
Yes,
accurate?
through bank statements.
Through
A lot
bank
of the money didn't
statements.
go through the banks, of course, but what they've traced through bank statements is approximately 41 million.
Right.
And they've made a recovery of about 4 million, as I understand things, approximately 10%.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, of great concern to many other creditors when they see Pleterski flying around the world.
Right. Because there's a certain percentage that's still, to my understanding, kind of unaccounted for fully. And so the question might be, is he continuing to live off his, ill-gotten gains, I guess you would say.
Right. And the trustee has accounted for much of it.
Right.
But there's a whole other segment of what Pleterski was doing that, in all likelihood, and we know this from some of the victims who contacted our office, that never went through the bank system.
Right.
It was cash, or it was crypto, or some other form of moving asset. Of course, Pleterski's not reporting that to his trustee.
Right. Right. Another question that I've received or that I've heard is in the episode, the W5 episode, there was information about the fact that Aiden Pleterski was briefly kidnapped, and they showed pictures of his badly beaten face. And then it came out that one of the individuals allegedly involved in the kidnapping was a bankruptcy inspector. So can you just kind of give us some more information about that aspect of the story?
Yes. So our initial client involved in the Pleterski case, he had lost about 1.1 million. And when he found out that Pleterski had been assigned into bankruptcy, he wanted to, know from the inside what was going on with the bankruptcy. He was concerned about his money. So he wanted to become an inspector. So he asked us to go to the first creditors meeting where the inspectors are elected and who the trustee was going to be. He wanted to bring in his own trustee because the trustee who was initially assigned the case didn't take these measures immediately to get judicial controls put on Pleterski. And so at the first meeting of creditors, there was a vote for 5 creditors out of the group that was there to be inspectors. Our client was voted in as an inspector. This fellow named Akil Haywood was voted in as an inspector. So we checked out who the other inspectors were, and it didn't take a rocket science to find out through a Google search that Akil Haywood had a admitted criminal record for trafficking in cocaine, and it served a 4 to 5 year sentence for this. This was on an article where Akil Haywood was being interviewed, and he was admitting to his record. We didn't have some other inside information on his record. It was what he posted on the internet, or what some people who interviewed him posted on the internet. Anyway, we advised the trustee that one of his inspectors had a serious criminal record. And the trustee told us, well, there's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing in the Bankruptcy Insolvency Act that gives us grounds to have him removed. So this fellow with the serious record stayed on in the inner circle like the board of directors, to the trustee during this bankruptcy investigation. And then at a certain point later on, Pleterski was kidnapped. And so how did the kidnappers find Pleterski? Did this happen as a result of information that Akil Haywood received through the bankruptcy process? That'll all come out. The bottom line is that Akil Haywood is one of the persons charged, one of 5 people charged with the kidnapping of Pleterski and then an extortion to obtain money from various people afterwards. So an extortion to get money out of Pleterski, and remarkably, an extortion to get money from the trustee. So somebody phoned the trustee and demanded money so that Pleterski wouldn't be injured. Akil Haywood is in that group of people who were charged. This is highly unusual.
Right. That's really a just absolutely wild part of the story. I mean, really, you don't hear about that
And then the
in
day
many
after,
other cases.
and the day after Akil Haywood was charged, he resigned his role as an inspector in the bankruptcy.
Yeah, I'm sure he didn't have a good relationship with the trustee after that. Wow, that's really fascinating. So I think that kind of brings us to the end of our discussion. But I just had one more topic to address kind of as a parting thought. In your view, what should fraud victims and generally other interested participants learn or take away from the saga of Aiden Pleterski, Colin Murphy, and Ryan Rumble, otherwise known as the Crypto Bros?
General advice to anyone who are investing with unlicensed people is don't invest more than you can lose. Don't invest in something you don't understand, and get a second opinion from someone you trust, a close family member, and preferably a professional, especially if you're talking numbers that are significant. If it's $5,000, you're not going to pay a professional. If it's $100,000, you use a real estate lawyer to buy and sell a house.
Right.
Why? Because you need some due diligence done.
Right. And do you have any parting thoughts on the benefits of the civil court system, as it pertains to the case of the Crypto Bros versus the other ongoing systems like the criminal system or the bankruptcy system?
The only system that operates with any speed is the civil system. And the only part of the civil system that operates with any speed is the urgent injunction motion process at the beginning. Otherwise, every court system is inefficient.
Right. And that's where you found success, or you found success with, in the Murphy case and in the Rumble case. Success being, measures put in place, ability to trace and preserve assets, just kind of those general things.
Yes.
Well, thanks so much, Norm, for giving me some of your time and kind of explaining your story a little bit to everybody who might be watching.